What happens when ordinary people are given power? Imagine walking into a building as an ordinary college student, and just a few hours later, you're ordering another human being to strip naked, do humiliating exercises, and obey your every command. The strange part, nobody was supposed to be a real prisoner. Nobody was supposed to be a real guard. It was an experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo and his team at Stanford University wanted to investigate a disturbing question. What happens when ordinary people are placed inside a powerful social role? Would prisoners become passive? Would guards become aggressive? Or would people simply behave according to the situation they were placed in? To find out, researchers selected 24 male college students who were considered psychologically and physically healthy. Then they divided them randomly into two groups, guards and prisoners. The students didn't know what was about to happen, but the experiment was about to become famous for a reason nobody expected. Because within days, the line between pretending and reality started to disappear. And that's where things got disturbing. The experiment began on August 14th, 1971. The researchers transformed the basement of Stanford's psychology building into a fake prison. There were cells, bars, a small prison yard, and observation equipment. It looked convincing enough to create the feeling that this wasn't a psychology laboratory anymore. It was a prison. The students assigned to become prisoners were told to wait at home. Then something happened that made the experiment feel frighteningly real. Police officers from Palo Alto actually arrested them. The participants were taken from their homes, handcuffed, searched, fingerprinted, photographed, and brought to the mock prison. Imagine knowing you're participating in a study and then suddenly having police officers treat you like a real criminal. That psychological shock was part of the setup. Once inside, the prisoners were stripped, searched, given prison clothing, and assigned identification numbers. Instead of being called by their names, they were referred to by numbers. The guards were given uniforms, wooden batons, whistles, and mirrored sunglasses. And there was one crucial instruction. They were allowed to maintain order, but they were not given a detailed script telling them exactly how to behave. That created something fascinating. The guards had power, but they had to decide what to do with it. At first, everything seemed almost normal. The participants joked around. Some guards appeared friendly, some prisoners treated the situation like a game, but then the atmosphere changed. And it changed surprisingly fast. The guards began introducing increasingly strict rules. Prisoners were ordered to line up. They were forced to repeat their identification numbers. They were punished for disobedience, and some guards began using humiliation as a method of control. One punishment was forcing prisoners to perform repetitive physical exercises. Push-ups became a tool of discipline, and the disturbing part wasn't that researchers had specifically designed every punishment. Much of the behavior emerged from the interaction between the participant and the situation. Then came the first major breakdown. One prisoner became extremely distressed. He reportedly began showing signs of severe emotional stress. He cried, he became disorganized, and he appeared psychologically overwhelmed. The researchers eventually released him, but instead of stopping the experiment, they continued. And this is where the story becomes even more controversial. The prison environment began developing its own social system. The guards had authority. The prisoners had almost none. And every day, the imbalance became more obvious. Some prisoners rebelled. They refused orders. They barricaded themselves inside their cells. The guards responded by trying to regain control. The conflict escalated, and after the rebellion, the guards began using more aggressive psychological tactics. Some prisoners were isolated. Others were humiliated. The guards discovered that they didn't need physical violence to maintain control. Sometimes, all they needed was psychological pressure. One particularly disturbing technique involved placing rebellious prisoners in a small isolation room. The prisoners were told they could earn their way out by giving up privileges or cooperating. The situation was becoming less like a simulation and more like a real prison. And here's the chilling question. Were the guards becoming cruel because they were cruel people? Or was the situation changing their behavior? That question was exactly what the experiment was supposed to investigate, but there was another problem. The researchers themselves were becoming involved. Philip Zimbardo wasn't simply watching the prison from a distance, he became the prison superintendent. And that meant he wasn't just observing the experiment, he was becoming part of the system. This would later become one of the biggest criticisms of the study. The people running the experiment were no longer completely outside the situation they were studying. Meanwhile, the prisoners became increasingly stressed. Some broke down emotionally, some became passive, some resisted, and some adapted to the role. The longer the experiment continued, the more the identities of student and prisoner seemed to disappear behind the roles. And then something happened that forced the experiment to end. A graduate student named Christina Masloch visited the mock prison. She was reportedly shocked by what she saw. She questioned whether the experiment should continue, and her reaction helped Zimbardo realize just how far the situation had gone. The planned experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It lasted only 6 days. 6, not 14. The experiment was stopped on August 20th, 1971, and that became one of the most famous conclusions in psychology. Put ordinary people into a powerful social situation. Give some authority, take authority away from others, and behavior can change dramatically. But here's where the story gets more complicated. For decades, the Stanford prison experiment was presented as powerful evidence that ordinary people can quickly become abusive when given power. It appeared to demonstrate something terrifying about human nature, but later researchers questioned whether the experiment actually proved that. And this is where the Stanford prison experiment gets even more interesting. Researchers have pointed out problems with the methodology. The sample was extremely small. There were only 24 participants, all male college students. The experiment also lacked a proper control group. And later investigations and analyses raised questions about how much the guards were actually encouraged to behave aggressively. In other words, were the guards naturally becoming brutal, or were they receiving signals about how the researchers expected them to behave? That's a completely different question, and it changes the meaning of the experiment. Some participants also later described the experience differently from the famous story. This means we shouldn't simply say, give people power and they automatically become evil. That's not what the evidence can safely prove. Instead, the experiment raises a more complicated question. How much of our behavior comes from who we are, and how much comes from the situation we're placed in? Because the most frightening lesson may not be that humans are secretly monsters. It may be that social environments can influence our behavior far more than we realize. Think about it. At school, you're one person. At work, you're another. Around your friends, you behave differently. Put someone in a position of authority, and they may act differently again. Give someone a uniform, a title, rules, and power. And suddenly, the same person may make decisions they would never make in another environment. That's why the Stanford prison experiment became so influential. Not because it perfectly explained human nature, it didn't, but because it forced psychologists, researchers, and ordinary people to ask an uncomfortable question. If the situation around you changed completely, how much would you change? And there's one final twist. The experiment was supposed to teach us about prisoners and guards, but in the end, it may have taught us something equally important about the people running the experiment. Because when researchers themselves became emotionally involved in the prison environment, the experiment demonstrated something unintentionally powerful. Sometimes the hardest person to observe objectively is yourself. The Stanford prison experiment ended after just 6 days, but its story lasted for decades. It became one of psychology's most famous experiments, and one of its most debated. And maybe that's the real lesson. Human behavior isn't always a simple battle between good people and bad people. Sometimes the environment changes the rules. The rules change the roles. The roles change the behavior, and eventually, people can forget where the role ends and where the real person begins. So the next time you see someone with power behaving differently than you expected, don't just ask, was this person always like this? Ask something more uncomfortable. What would happen to me if I were given the same power?